Let's just see if we go live. And your audience will see it in a moment, it says. So it is not streaming yet. Okay, it seems we are live. So, welcome back again. We have OTD back for this episode of Behind the Lines.
Hello, my head is the size of this bedroom dresser.
My goodness, what have you been eating, OTD?
So, airheads, nothing but airheads.
So I guess, as I normally like to do, we'll start at the beginning. So I think you briefly mentioned this in Track Talk, actually, but how did you get into Line Rider?
Ooh, there are many ways to get into Line Rider. And I got into Line Rider in different senses of the word at different ages. It was a flash game staple at the YMCA Kids Center. There were computers that people would go on and they would play flash games. Line Rider was there, and I would make things in that. I was very early in my life, like got to be like first or second grade. Not first or second grade. Like third or fourth, somewhere in there. But I remember when my dad had to go and do stuff in the evenings, I would go to the Y, and there I would play some Line Rider. I got into the community like sixth grade. I was on Elite Line Rider, which had an embarrassing method of ranking tracks via beginner, intermediate, advanced, and elite, along with Hall of Fame, which was Flagtapper's personal curation. It was very much like it's time to rank the tracks, baby, because that was what you'd do. It'd be like, hey, these people have better tracks than these people. It's very comparative, very like not what I do now, but like that was where I would first post things. Made friends early on with like Pure 5152 and like Bush Radar 22.
Great names.
Oh yeah. And eventually it would be like I would move on from there and go to Line Rider. I would say my first yeah, your life.
I hope so. I get paranoid.
The first track I really broke, I think, into any kind of scene with was Anthem. It was this very slow manu quirk. I think we had this like dichotomy that like quirks were these like cold and calculated tracks, and then slow manuals were emotional because they used slower and emotional music. But it was like that was the divide, and so I became the slow manuals guy. So I would make those, and I did those pretty much constantly for a long time. And then finally, once I got to like around, I think, the Gorge, Forced into the Earth, Daisies, that was when I was like, okay, it has not been existentially satisfying to make manuals and alt quirk for years of my life. So that was around college. At that point, I definitely transitioned into a different sort of phase of track making, in which, I don't know, I cared about the relationship between Bosch and the line in a different way, in a fundamentally different way, I think. Anyway, that's how I got into Line Rider, and that's how I got to where I am now.
Fair enough. So, who would you say inspired you back then, and who would you say inspires you now? Like, how has that changed over the years?
Back then, I was a huge fan of Giorgio's tracks. The sort of sleights of hands he would pull with the manuals completely blew everyone's mind at the time. I still really enjoy it for its like subversion of expectations at this point. Very fun stuff. I used to really like Leomer because he would the motion and the way he would control Bosch were very like jazzy in a way that others weren't. Sort of play with rotation in a different way, and like a lot of the sort of alt and progressive and like uh early fling quirk, it was like picking a flavor of ice cream. You had several unquantifiable reasons why you liked one better than the other, in the same way that you can't really delineate between your favorite flavors of ice creams and the ones that you don't like outside of like basic things like I don't like the texture or something like that. It would be like I don't like the way that guy rotates hand walls, that kind of thing.
Sure.
Uh, so yeah, it was a little bit of that, a little bit of Leomer, a little bit of Flycapper for a time. Uh, these days, I get a lot of inspiration from both Rabbit and Conundrumer for very different reasons for their approaches to things. Um, I think Conundrumer specifically for how he reacts to he'll react to an idea being popular and then immediately like implement it in a way that is cheeky, funny, kind of pokes fun at it. Conundrum can essentially invent line rider culture, uh, like at the tap of his fingers. Uh, Ravid, uh, for me, like where do I even start? In my approaches to different tracks, they've been so influential. They've just they've built uh, all kinds of frameworks that I can use to make that I find personally. Uh, and then have since allowed me to sort of branch off on my own and explore things that they aren't necessarily. Um, like the Gorge was definitely like a project that I was making, and then they were guiding me. Like Rabbit had like these ideas about scenery fundamentals and basically taught them to me when I made the Gorge. Um, but like since then, I've developed my own sort of style and approach to things, and I think it paid off, especially in shortcuts. For me, that felt like something that was uniquely my own, and something that also diverged from the typical canon of like line rider scenery tracks, and that it has like different sections that are each cohesive but like connected to each other and like all feel like their own individuated places, you know?
Yeah. I have to say, with shortcuts, one of the, I mean, first of all, I'm glad to see that finish because I remember you posting the naked track for that probably like 8 or 9 months ago, maybe. But
Yeah, I finished it all in like a week for the scene. I just had to kick my own ass to do it.
fair enough. But yeah, I particularly enjoyed the rolling hills section you had towards the end of that. I thought that was very effective because it just
I had another idea that I was going to work in with that, but I will keep secret until I actually use it.
until you've got it perfect, I guess. Okay. So obviously we kind of covered this fairly extensively in Dangerous Cargo, but how would you say you approach a track? Do you even view it as a track, or is it just a narrative that you want to tell?
How do I approach a track? Humor me and conceptualize a track this way. A track is a track is a framework and a container for ideas. Uh, it's a sieve through which ideas are refined, articulated, and expressed. In this way, it's much like a language. Uh, Tracks themselves are a form of communication. They're like all art, they are a conversation between the piece and the audience.
Yes, that's I think to recall Rabbit saying a kind of dialogue between, in this case, Bosch and the line.
Yes, that is I really love that framework, honestly. It's such a neat way of thinking about it because it completely changes how you think about how you want Bosch to move. When you're doing choreography when you're making like worlds, set pieces, ideas, like elements for different things. I think genuinely, you have to start when you're making something that's going to have like a level of like narrative to it. There has to be planning and forethought put into it. You can't just start and be like, I'm going to do this thing. If you're lucky, which many of the early narrative-based tracks were, you start a thing and then you retroactively assign a narrative to it. Tracks like what's a good one? Braggadocio, actually.
Okay.
Commentary on the quirk-based nature of things and comparing it to gang culture, I guess. The do it because everyone else is doing it nature of that braggadocio is pretty aggressively shading. I think a lot of people were. My favorite reaction, I think, was when Raphael was like, "This track maybe seems a little bit aggressive." Like, yeah, that's what we're going for. Because you can't be subtle when you're saying something like that. Anyway, that started out as me being like, I wonder if I can make a track that's just one line. And after a couple seconds of that, I'm like, hey, this goes well with this Run the Jewels track. And then Raven was like, oh, this could be a sick idea where we do it. And it just went back and forth from there. And I'm like, you want to do the animation for this part? And they were like, yeah. And so there was a lot of, yeah. For me, that one was about obscuring technicality. Where my goal wasn't to make something that was impressive because the tricks that were used, but was impressive in spite of the tricks that were used.
Yeah.
Something that felt like it was the graphical representation of a rapper flying off the handle on something.
Yeah.
So what you do is you think of an idea or a concept and you're like, filter that out, filter that through LineWriter. What do you get? Filter a space opera through LineWriter and you get dangerous cargo. Filter a triptych, like a Hieronymus Bosch style triptych, through LineWriter, and what do you get? You get shortcuts. Though, frankly, I think threes are prevalent in a lot of my tracks already. In terms of,
I guess the last two
Dangerous
tracks.
Cargo is sectioned into 3 parts, and then the second part of Dangerous Cargo itself is sectioned into 3 parts.
Oh yeah.
So it is. There's 3 parts in the triptych. There's all kind of things. I think there's sections of Clothesline that have like 3 flags or something like that. Anyway, I think it's a clean number. I use a lot. Unrelated completely to the question at hand, which is start with an idea, filter it through LineWriter, see what you get.
True. But I guess you're more filtering it through yourself, really. But
you filter it through yourself and into LineWriter, right?
Yeah. You're more the conduit.
Yes. And this is not to suggest either that like LineWriter, you could just, to make new ideas, you just do like cultural mashups of different things, because you've all met that annoying person who's like an executive producer pitching television ideas who's like, it's Star Trek but with bears, or like it's Game of Thrones but with like it's this but with blank. Is not an exciting idea. It becomes like culturally pretty derivative pretty quickly.
Yeah, it shouldn't be, but it sure does sell.
Yeah, well, hey. So that's not to say when you're looking at LineWriter, I didn't go just like 2001, but LineWriter, right? Is
yeah, it's slightly
what
different.
You do is you draw on things you know, and the ways that you're culturally informed by things, and you say, through which lens would I appropriately convey this thing? A sci-fi lens, perhaps, uh, a sort of naturalistic lens. There are many different ways to do that. And oh, my laptop died, so I can no longer see the chat. You'll have to be responsible for me.
Don't worry, my laptop is still alive.
Okay. I guess the point is, like, take your experiences, put them in it. Because that's what you're going to be proud of when you look back. Part of you is, because I don't look back on my line writer career and think, damn, funk was a real, Bosch was moving for those 1.5 minutes. I think about, like, man, I remember trying to convey the scale of an enormous octopus, and like that feeling of danger, and like I think about the ways in which people reacted to that, the ways in which people reacted to, like, and that's not to say either that you should do this solely for the reactions of other people, but I think it's a fun part of it if you get reactions, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I guess several of your tracks have been like that, like Braga Dokio. I mean, that one for me, like, I think the comment I left was just swag. Because I've never seen a track that kind of like gave me that impression any more than that one. And then I guess you have DC, which that definitely got a lot of talk as well.
Yeah, I think if you can look at my recent history stuff, it's been trying to isolate certain feelings that people get and distill them into a form that's compatible with line writer. For Dangerous Cargo, it's isolation. For Shortcuts, I think it's a little bit adrenaline, a little bit like exploration. For like The Forest Under the Earth, I think there's a sort of resoluteness that comes with it. If I had better conveyed the idea that, like, hey, this is where Bosch is going to die, there would have been a greater sense of finality. But there's that. The Gorge, it's like just interacting with and existing in a world, you know? Like, I think my earliest example is probably Come to Daddy. God, that track. I think that's the only track with a jump scare in it. But that was my attempt to convey, like, creeping horror, and I think the music did that more than the track itself.
Yeah.
It initially was an expression of anger because I didn't get into some college, but as you can see, I turned out fine. I'm still in college.
Yeah.
But senior year, I was like, I didn't get into Caltech. I'm thinking about it now. I wouldn't have been happy at Caltech to begin with, but that is a completely unrelated story.
Yeah, you always have to look at the silver linings for all of these things.
Mm-hmm. These questions. Put another one in your question catapult and fire it my way.
Yeah, so I guess you have a very holistic approach maybe to making tracks. Like you're not really like you have a very big picture that you kind of take into account. Like you seem to be very thematic. But how much does any individual element play into one of your projects? Like for instance, let's take music. How essential do you think music is to line writer, given that we share it in an audio-visual format?
I think that there can be silent tracks. I don't think music is like an essential part necessarily. because most of the time that's how we experience Line Rider. We experience it without sound. That's how we first go about playing things. We hear videos with music in them, but we don't necessarily think of Line Rider as something that is intentionally like full of sound, even though we're encouraged to use it.
True.
Um, I think a lot of tracks are music fan fiction. I think a lot of tracks are like, oh, this would be cool if Bosch was moving like right there with the Imagine Dragons or whatever.
Yep, that's how I made some of my tracks, I think. Especially when I was
They
starting
are
out.
music. Yeah, a lot of your early tracks are like music fan fiction to like EDM or some shit like that.
Hell yeah, boy.
It's like I think that's it. We see Line Rider and then we see the music and we're like, oh, okay, this is how I would want Bosch to move in this, and so that's a very natural reaction. But I think for me is not letting the music dictate it too much, and when to let sort of Bosch take the reins on those. You'll notice I don't sync exactly to every sort of hill in shortcuts. I will sync to moments that I feel deserve emphasis.
Sure. Yeah, like at the
And
end of it, at the end of the sort of forestry scene, there's some really precise syncs that kind of follow up from the more general ones, I guess.
Yeah, they're meant to sort of. Also, the early ones are messing around with which part of the piano I'm syncing with, because for each one it's like da 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 dun 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 dun. So sometimes I'll be syncing like da 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 dun dun, and I'll sync on that part, or I'll be like dun 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 dun. So basically, where I think the flashbulb is putting emphasis on the piano, I will put there, because I think it'll be fun. Like there's a part where it's like da 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 dun 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 dun, and it's like that one dun dun is not present in the rest of them, and so I was like, okay, I'm gonna highlight that part. It's usually pretty stream of consciousness when I'm making stuff that syncs like that. I'll just like listen and be like, here's an emphasis, here's an emphasis, here's an emphasis. How do I want this to work?
Okay. Yep. Go ahead.
When I'm doing more precise stuff, there's a lot more like concentration paid to it. But yeah, that. But sometimes I will just let Bosch kind of go, and then I'll do another hit. You know, it's a very push pull relationship, I think.
Yeah, totally. So I think we've covered how you approach tracks and your kind of method, if you have a method, probably pretty extensively by this point. So I think to avoid reiterating ourselves, I'll move on and ask, what would you say your goal is with Line Rider in general?
I think there are some things that Line Rider allows us to uniquely convey. And I think it's because it's such a restrictive medium that it breeds a certain level of creativity. And I find myself like when I see where we were for a lot of like 2007 through 2013, and to a certain extent now, honestly, I can't help but feel like the entire creative scope of Line Rider is like this giant like paint by numbers like canvas, right? And we have spent all of our time painting little tiny details into one little cell. We have just exquisitely painted that cell. We have done so much in that cell, but we have done so little outside it. So my goal is to get to the rest of the canvas.
So yeah, you want to paint yourself outside of the box.
Yeah, because I again, I think the spectrum of tracks that have been made across all of space and time is frustratingly, blindingly specific along a tiny spectra of what we can do in Line Rider.
True.
There's so much, and at times it is very rough. It sometimes feels like I'm one of maybe like 3 people who are like trying to get outside of that, and so it's tough because I feel like there's a certain responsibility that I feel in myself to be like, okay, I need to explore these concepts so that like Line Rider has these concepts out there, right?
Yeah.
Like so that the world is presented with an alternative vision for what Line Rider can be, because is even things that you would normally think of as like, oh, these deviate pretty far from it, I still think fall fairly within conventional. They still fall within that cell. They might be closer to the edge, mind you, but I don't think they're like. Think about it this way, right? Let's take
Yep.
a track like Type R by Pure 5152. If I don't know how well versed you are in sort of progressive Quark from like 2012, but I could probably name like 7 or 8 tracks that are like Type R.
Okay.
And then I asked you that question earlier. Can you name another track that is like Dangerous Cargo that implements the same things that Dangerous Cargo does to the same extent?
Not really. No.
What about Clothesline? Do you see anything like that?
Oh, there might be one or two if I was really pressed that I could probably look up. But
Like synced to the like the bounces of the music are synced to like descending through a line of flags as if you're falling slowly through a net, done in a single cohesive environment.
no, then I would say no. There is. Oh, what track am I trying to think of? I guess there's Bailey by Gayo. Kind of is kind of in the same vein as Clothesline, but it's not really done in any way in with the same kind of intentions in mind. Like it's not like lots of tightly precise syncs, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I think Bailey is one of the more radical departures from the norm out there, which, I mean, if you're looking for a real fucking iconoclast of line rider, Gary Bell is probably one of the ones to look at for just stuff that's outside of the norms. I think to a certain extent. Um, I guess what I'm getting at is like I've tried a lot of ground that not a lot of other people have followed up. Uh, Stuff they haven't done before, and like people haven't done it after either. Like nobody's taking these ideas and being like, how do I implement them in new things?
Yeah.
Doing the same things that they usually do. I think a lot of people have sort of relegated themselves to this idea that they have their own like personal brand of like things that they do. I think Giorgio did that for a long time. It's like I'm the guy who makes manuals go between one side of the line and the other.
Hmm.
And I'm gonna make a bunch of tracks that do that with some XY occasionally.
Yeah, I mean, people can definitely become typecast. I think that's something that I've tried to avoid through, I guess, the 1 year experience I have of making line rider tracks. I try and keep stuff different, but really, I haven't really gone outside the same formula very much. So, I mean, I could definitely see, for example, people take stuff from tracks like This Will Destroy You or Mountain King or Ruby Falls, but I've never seen anyone really like properly explore the kind of themes you're talking about, like maybe stuff like Dangerous Cargo. Like, there, I think I've seen some tracks that kind of might play on themes of like escapism or try to let's say like
It's a common
emulate
theme of like
emotion.
getting out of here. is a pretty
Mhm.
common theme. But okay, so like, let me put it this way, right? There's to make dangerous cargo work, I did like 15 different things. The opening is done by drawing the sun in Line Rider, photoshopping out the background, taking a night mode image of stars that I've done with the LRA points,
Mhm.
doing static images of those, then taking those in Premiere and having them scroll like parallax, so it looks like the spaceship
Yeah.
is like moving relative to like it's orbiting. Uh,
Yeah.
um, and that's the kind of thing you can only really achieve if you're like, I want to do this, and how do I do it? Right?
Yeah.
You don't start with, this is how I do a thing, and then it has this effect. You go with, I want to do this thing. What are the steps I need to take to get
Yeah.
there?
I mean, actually, come to think of it, I actually do have a track planned. I mean, it's not really dangerous cargo themed, but the exact thing you were just talking about, like a sun with objects moving across it, is something I do actually plan to make in Line Rider, possibly in my next track. Like if you could imagine the idea of an eclipse happening in the background of a track or as part of a track, or if you could imagine Bosch moving through space to a theme of uh, what even is the theme? It's mostly just to do with the music, I guess, and orbiting. But I don't know if I can even call orbiting a theme. It's very early stages at the moment. But
Anyway,
yeah, really, we should try and stay on track, I guess. So yeah, the next question I normally ask people is, who do you make tracks for? Are they mostly for yourself or for your audience?
oh boy, if I made tracks for my audience, they would be sorely disappointed with my upload speed. Uh, I think it's partially for myself, for sure. It's because I have these ideas and I want to express them. I think it's partially because I want artist communication, right? I want people to see what I got going on in my head outside. Is an expression of the inner brain outward. And that's a two-part exchange. I have to be there and the other people have to be there. And that exchange is what's important. Um, so to say I make the art for myself or for another person uh, would be kind of an incomplete understanding of like what I want to do with the art, which is I want to have it communicated with another person. I'm doing it for the communication that involves both of us. Uh, I'm making it for myself so that I can express the idea, and I'm making it for others so that they can see my expression. I want others to see my expression and connect with it in some way. Um, so that's as best as I can answer that.
Yeah, so you see one as not being complete without the other, like they both entail the same thing.
You can't isolate them.
Yeah. So yeah, the next question that I tend to ask would be, how do you feel about the state of track making today?
Oh, can of worms.
Well, you can open them on this show, man. Like anything
Oh,
goes.
all right, here we go. I think I've said as much about tiny little paint by numbers corner.
For sure.
I still think that's the case. I think very few people explore outside of ideas that they think will impress other people. I think few people explore outside of uh, ideas that are uh, safe. I, I think there's a lot of very safe ideas happening. I don't think there's a lot of risks being taken. I don't think people are willing to make themselves vulnerable and make something that feels like a genuine expression of emotion. I think there's a lot of ironic distance that's been attached to making tracks where it's like this was especially prevalent in like the 2010s early. It was like I'm just making this track for fun, and then being like, if somebody criticized it, they would just be like, no, you can't criticize it because I'm making this track for fun. And it would just be the cycle of like, I'm not making this track for you, but also the people desperately caring about what people think about their track. So I think it'd be like a freeing of ourselves from that. This idea that like if somebody criticizes a part of your track, that like they think you're a bad person, you're a bad artist, because I think these are people interpret like mild discomfort as personal attack, and it's it makes it really difficult to have substantive criticism. Stuff that really gets to the essence of like what's being done, what's being communicated. I really, really wish, I really wish more people were making stuff that was narratively challenging, that was that is boundary breaking, that is conceptually interesting, that is beyond the scope of what we're currently doing. I want all of these things, and I think to tack on to why I make tracks, part of the reason why I make these tracks is because I make the tracks I want to see. I make the stuff and the concepts that I want to see implemented, and stuff that I would like to see other people picking up.
Yeah.
I don't see that right now.
So you're trying to be the change you want to see.
I have tried to be the change for too many goddamn years. It's I don't think I need to be the change so much as I just need to make stuff that I find fulfilling for myself.
Sure.
And that hopefully resonates with some people. We'll see.
So
that's that.
So we'll see. But to elaborate on that, do you believe that, or have you seen a trend where people are starting to follow suit and explore boundaries, or do you think it will just continue as track making has done?
I think people will do sort of esoteric or naive boundary breaking, where they'll be like, here's a way I'm going to break it, but like kind of play it safe and like do it within the confines of traditional track making. I see that a lot, where it's like, I'm going to try and break it. And then people will be like, I think you could have gone like further or all the way. And they'll be like, oh, you didn't like the concept. I guess I just want to explore it further now.
That's interesting.
Where it's like flirting with the idea of boundary breaking, but like really tightly holding on to the idea that you need to have this thing, and this thing to be impressive, right? I just like, frankly, I think that a lot of things where like quirk is being used to tell a story, and I don't mind seeing quirk in storytelling. I use it in Dangerous Cargo. There are granules. There are gravity wells. They exist. I use them. I'm not afraid of them, like I've been told I come off as, but I used them specifically because I felt like they were integrated into the story. When you place the technique first, and then are like, I'm going to convey the narrative using this technique, and I'm going to showcase the technique first and foremost, you are saying, I am going to commit myself to telling the story, no matter how shittily, with the exact through the exact methods I've always used. And like, you can't be afraid to like use new methods. You can't be afraid to like eschew ones that you already have. You're gonna have to throw some stuff in the kitchen sink if you're gonna like do new stuff. That means some of your old tools are going to be useless.
Sure.
Some of your old tools are going to be ineffective for the job, and people are so afraid of letting go of those tools they have because they mean so much to their community status and their impressiveness as track makers that they won't toss it out.
So So you believe that a lot of track makers are kind of afraid to branch out or to evolve in new ways because they hold on to this assumed hierarchy.
Not even afraid, just I don't think they want to do anything else.
Just not interested.
And I think when they want to put on the appearance of exploring new ideas, that's when the fear comes in.
Hmm.
Like, if people are like, "Yes, this is kind of the same as before," and they want that same like reception of people liking their tracks, but they
Right.
have to like try new stuff. Their reaction is to try new stuff using the same things that they've already done. And so when you don't have an idea of like, uh, when you've used the same tools for decades, that's incredibly hard to just be like, okay, I'm going to put these aside for a moment. I'm going to try something else.
Yeah,
Um,
for sure.
so yeah, I think people alternate between being afraid and complacent.
Okay. So, yeah, how much would you say you put into tracks emotionally and time-wise? I mean, we've kind of discussed time, like you say, you're quite sporadic, but how much would you say, or even not just emotionally, how much do you like give of yourself when you're working on a track?
Um, time wise, I've already mentioned bursts. I can do a track in a week. I can do a track and then finish it a year later. uh, Emotionally, how much of myself do I put into it? That's a pretty good question. I would say this is not a 100% uh, correlation, but I've found that the more I've detached myself from the track, the worse it's been. Both like in terms of how I perceive the track to be in terms of track quality and just generally like how I feel about making the track. The
Hmm.
more I detach myself from it, the worse I feel.
Yeah.
Uh, if there's one thing I think people are especially afraid of, it is genuine emotional expression, and I think that's an important part of making a line rider track is learning how to channel that expression into something, into a piece of art, and make it make it a part of you. I think.
Hmm.
I
Yes.
think people are so often afraid to make a track into a reflection of a part of them because that's vulnerability, and
Sometimes,
that's
yeah. Go ahead.
uh, emotional vulnerability is tough. It's it's not something you go into line rider expecting to do. Like, I'm going to put my whole self into the sled person.
Yeah. It's
You go on.
yeah, it's something that I have done in one of my maybe mid tracks. What did I even call it? It was the one before Mountains. Now I can't remember its name. First Steps was its name, but it was because I made it so personal, and because I saw things in the track that no one else would really be able to relate to. So like
Hmm.
sometimes you can give a lot of yourself, and it can affect you emotionally, but you almost give so much to the point that it's inscrutable to everyone else, like it's just a track. So I guess like there has to be like a balance where you have to be able to show what you feel as well rather than just feeling it. Like feeling it's one thing, but sharing is another, or ability to convey.
Part of bettering yourself as an artist is learning how to make that transition from the personal to a general audience and knowing when to do that uh, and how to do that precisely.
Mm.
Um, Something I think is really important is that remember that sort of dichotomy we had between realism and iconization with respect to how it's also possible beyond a certain level of iconization to get too abstract.
True.
Um, and for something that is an incredibly specific experience to you to be conveyed so abstractly that it's unclear
Mm,
that that's what you're meaning to do.
mm,
So for me, when I'm approaching things like that, when I'm putting an element in something, my question to myself is always, uh, do I would I understand this if I were just looking at it normally? Would I see what they're saying? Uh, if I get like a little twinge and I'm like, I can kind of relate, that's good. That's a starting place. If I'm like, no, then it I've realized that I've kind of lost the thread there. And developing as an artist means that you figure out when you've lost the thread earlier and earlier and earlier each time. You figure out all of the loose ends and you learn how to tie them back in together.
mm.
And that's the magic. That's where you can find something, I think.
Yeah, totally. So, the last question I normally ask relates to what you would say to a new person joining. So, let's say someone watching this video has just started getting into Line Rider. What advice would you give them?
Hmm. I would say this to those people. You probably started out uh, getting into Line Rider by watching Line Rider tracks. Uh, and it's useful for sort of learning the Line Rider vocabulary. And this is going to seem a bit counterintuitive, but if you're just starting out in Line Rider, my advice is to not watch Line Rider tracks. Uh, as they are presented, uh, as they're done, they people invariably start by mimicking people they know, and you can either move on from that or you don't, and most people don't. Uh, so I would say not to don't look at Line Rider tracks necessarily. Uh, don't look at Line Rider tracks exclusively. Um, look at art. Look at things that inspire you. Look at things that are deeply resonant to you, and think about them a lot. And think about, hey, can I talk about this through Line Rider? Do I have the tool set to do that yet? If you don't, get the tool set and then work through it. You're not always going to find the right tools in a Line Rider track, though. You will often find them elsewhere. For me, the skills I learned for shortcuts came from reading a graphic novel. Uh, all of my skill related to that uh, comes from a graphic novel, comes from uh, my experience as a video editor. We all have these deep wells that we can draw on. And I think the current repository of Line Rider videos is too shallow a well to draw from if you're looking to truly express the mess that's inside you. If you're not looking to do that, if you're just looking to mess around, uh, go for it. Do what you want. But if you're like looking to legitimately like feel something and express that thing through Line Rider, don't watch Line Rider videos.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly very easy to be influenced by the videos we have. I mean, previously, I think you would say, technique focused tracks kind of dominated. Now we kind of have this era where it's almost hybridized. We're kind of moving away from being completely technique focused, but we also have a lot of theme driven or narrative driven or kind of emotive tracks, but it's not like 100%. It's kind of like half and half. So you have these both technical and kind of emotive tracks, which are still very enjoyable, but I guess they're not really on quite the level of expression that OTDE is referring to here.
For me, those are about as expressive as like watching a Guitar Hero track. It's satisfying. It syncs well. But and it's augmented certainly very well. But I don't think we should mistake that for expression. I think that's I think at its very base level, it's the innovation there comes from finding new ways to notate the music. It's music fan fiction, like I was saying.
So you would say that rather than being expressive, it's more mechanical?
I would say you mentioned how we moved from technique to narrative, and now we're in a sort of hybrid place. I would say that it's still technique elevated. It's just refined and reframed within the context of the music rather than existing isolated on its own.
Right.
So I would say that it's a continuation of sort of quirk and technique based dominance in the Line Rider video sphere, but just new name, lipstick on a pig.
Now it's to a beat kind of thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think I've probably exhausted my list of questions at this stage. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about?
I think that's it, really. I'm hopefully going to have a new track here before the end of the year. We'll see.
Awesome. Looking forward to it. So, at this point, I guess we'll conclude this episode of Behind the Lines. It looks like we managed to have 0 technical faults for this episode, which is always a plus. So, thanks for watching.
Did we get any questions in the chat?
Chat, if you're listening, now is your time. We did say, JC says that Come to Daddy had an influence on his track Nighttime Thoughts.
Oh, yeah. Ouch. That one, that Nighttime Thoughts kind of made me feel really fucking depressed, honestly.
Well, that's exactly what it was about.
Yeah, that's the point. As I, minus the suicidal thoughts, it was reminiscent to me of certain aspects of depression, though I don't necessarily think. I think, in a sense, for me, broken conveys the speed of depression a lot better. And for me, broken conveys a sort of sense of recovery. For me, Nighttime Thoughts kind of feels like a spiraling downwards, and there's no resolution, and there doesn't need to be one, but just kind of left me with a pit in my stomach, which is good. I have been successfully made to feel something.
Yeah, I don't think JC would disagree with you based on the interview we had earlier. So, yeah, I can't see any more questions popping up, so I guess that's probably going to be it for this one, guys.
All right.
Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for joining us, OTDE.
Yep.
Leave some like and love and hatred below in the comments.
Smash that motherfucking like button.
Smash that motherfucking dislike button. Okay. But yeah,
okay.
if this channel ever gets to a point of begging for likes, just Just end
It
it.
is right now. Please like the video. We're begging you.
Please, I'm on my knees.
I'm serious.
Okay.
Cool.
All right. Thanks a lot for watching, guys, and see you next time.